Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to tell you a tale of the mythological cycle of Irish mythology. It's a quite famous but also quite long story, so lean back, relax and listen to The Wooing of Etain. Before I start, I'd like to mention that there are a lot of Irish names in the story, and I try to figure out how to pronounce them correctly, and I try to pronounce them correctly to the best of my abilities. But it starts with the name Etain. I also heard the pronunciation Aiden or Etain, but I think Etain sounds most correct to my ears at least. But if you happen to be Irish and catch me mispronouncing something, please let me know in the comments down below how to pronounce it correctly, so I can learn from that. That said, on to the story. But brace yourself. It's a very interesting but also very long story, so I split it into two parts. Today we start with part 1 of The Wooing of Etain. Like many stories here on my channel, this story takes place back in the time when the Irish gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, also known as part of the fairy folk and residents of the other world in our times, still roamed the earth. Back in the day, it was the Dagda, the good god, also known as Ocha Ol-Her, that ruled as a high king over all of Ireland. He was beloved by his subjects, for he was a good king, and used his power to control weather and crops, to ensure that the people had plentiful harvests and that they prospered. But it came to happen that the Dagda desired a woman who was not his, but the wife of one of his subjects. He had set his eye on Boann, the wife of Alkmaar. Boann herself wasn't entirely unwilling to, well, let's say unite with the Dagda, but she feared the wrath of her powerful husband, and so declined the courtship attempts of the Dagda. But the Dagda was clever, and his desire was so great that he formed a clever plan to get what he wanted. One day he sent Alkmaar away to visit Bres, another of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who lived quite far away. But since Ireland never has been the biggest of islands, quite far away isn't far away enough. And so the Dagda also used his magic and compelled Alkmaar to not return until the next day arises, and that he would not get hungry or thirsty or even tired until then. That seems to be an odd spell, doesn't it? Well, okay, that will give the Dagda one day, and Bres, as host, an awkward evening with a guest who wouldn't eat or drink anything, and probably wouldn't leave so soon since he didn't get tired. Great, but no, the spell had actually a deeper meaning. For the Dagda also had the power over time, and so he also cast a spell that stretched a single day to be as long as 9 whole months. Alkmaar, not knowing what was going on, and not even suspecting anything, made his way to Bres, while the Dagda approached Boann. Dagda and Boann had a wonderful night of passion, in which Boann conceived a child. But when Alkmaar returned home, thinking only 1 day had gone by, really 9 months had gone by. The baby was already born, and the Dagda had taken it away, so that Alkmaar would never know what had happened. And so, in 1 single day, stretched into 9 months, the Dagda and Boann had become the parents of the well-known god Angus MacOg. Angus was brought to the house of Midir in Briré in Tabor, who then became his foster father and raised the child as his own, without ever giving him as much as a hint that Midir wasn't really his father. Thanks to the powers of the Dagda, Angus was accepted by the people, and among the hundreds of young nobles of Ireland who played ball all day long, and the hundreds of young maidens who loved to dance and sing all day long. Angus lived amongst them for around 9 years, raised with all the love Midir was able to give, and he grew into a handsome young lad. But even though Angus wasn't aware that he was merely a foster child of Midir, The other children were aware of that. And so, one day it happened that Angus arrogantly said to a young field-bowler called Triarch that he, as a peasant son, should address a noble like Angus with more respect. But Triarch just answered that at least he knew who his parents were. Angus was confused. What did Triarch mean? After all, he was the son of Midir and heir to Midir's estate. But the words of Triarch hurted Angus enough that he started to weep and started running to Midir, asking about the meaning of those words. Midir calmly explained to Angus that he indeed was a foster child, and that his real father was the Dagda, the High King himself, and that his mother was a woman of great beauty called Bowen, who was the wife of Elkmar. Angus understood why he was raised in secret, but now that he knew who his father was, he demanded to see him, and to be acknowledged, and to be able to ask him for lands of his own and the title he deserved as son of the High King, so that Field-Bolg son would never speak to him like that again. Midir agreed, and shortly after, the three men met at Uisneach, near Tara, the residence of the High Kings of Ireland, in the heart of the island, in today's County Meath. The Dagda calmly asked Midir for the reason for the meeting, and Midir answered that they had come so that the Dagda could acknowledge his son and give him a piece of land as he deserved as a son of the High King. The Dagda agreed that this wasn't too much to ask, but he also stated that there was no land that was vacant at the moment which he could give to his son. He stated that he would give Angus a part of the best land, the Brú na Bóinne, but that this part of the land was already occupied by none other than Elkmar. And so the three men thought of a plan how to get the land for Angus without starting a war with Elkmar. Then the Dagda had an idea. He told Angus to wait until the day of Samhain, for then all men would be at peace with one another and likely unarmed. Then he should take a sword and go to the Brú and confront and threaten Elkmar, who would likely sit and watch the youths play, while only being armed with a forked stick from white hazel. He told him that Elkmar would be easy to identify, for he would wear a gold brooch cloak, and Angus should tell Elkmar that he would only let him live if Elkmar promises him that he would be king of the Brú for a day and a night. At this point, I think I need to clarify two things. For once, yes, like I told you, Angus was only 9 years old. But since he wasn't really an ordinary child, he actually looked more like a young man, for he had grown faster than an ordinary child. So yes, he with a sword would be a threat for Elkmar. And second, a day and a night in Irish would be lá agus oíche, which could also be translated to for day and night, without an indefinite article. For in Irish, there are no definite articles. Understanding this, you might suspect what comes next. Angus executed the plan and got Elkmar to agree that he would be king for a day and a night. But when Elkmar returned after a day and a night, Angus refused to give the land back and told Elkmar that only the High King could decide on that matter. And when the Dagda arrived to judge the situation, Angus stated that Elkmar promised him to be king for day and night, and since it's always day or night, he would be king forever. Now you might understand my little lecture in Irish grammar. However, Elkmar was not able to disagree, and so the Dagda judged Angus' kingship to be legitimate. And since all men of Ireland had heard the judgment, Elkmar had no choice but to leave. But as a compensation, he got another piece of land from the Dagda that was just as profitable as the Brú na Bóinne. Elkmar was pleased with that compensation, and so, weirdly enough, everybody was happy. 1 year later, on the day of Samhain, Medir came back to the Brúna Bónne to visit his foster son. Medir found Angus sitting on the Mount of Shee in Broga, watching a match between two groups of youth, while Alkmaar was sitting on the Mount of Cleite, his new land, and watched the same match. It just happened that a brawl between both teams arose, but Medir told Angus not to interfere, for if Alkmaar would try the same, and both men were on the field, the situation could end very badly. Instead, Medir went down himself and tried to part the men from one another. He actually succeeded, but by bad luck he was hit by a split of holy that knocked out one of his eyes. When Medir came back to Angus, he held his lost eye in his hand and told Angus that he rued his visit, for now he wouldn't be able to go back to his own land. For Medir was king himself, and back in those times, a king could only be a king if he was of whole body and mind. But Angus didn't accept that. He had an idea. He suggested to visit the Kert, for he might be able to heal Medir. And so it was done. Angus went to the Kert, brought him with himself, and Medir was healed. After the whole trouble was over, Angus asked Medir to stay for a whole year, so that he could see his household, his folk, and his land. Medir declined, unless he would get a reward for staying. This might sound entitled by our standards, but was actually quite common back in those times. And so Angus asked what reward Medir would suggest. And Medir answered that he wanted a chariot worth 7 female slaves, a fitting mantle, and the most beautiful maiden in Ireland. Angus didn't even flinch and agreed to the first 2 items, but he stated that the fairest maiden in all of Ireland would be something pretty subjective, and that he wasn't sure who it could be. But Medir answered that he knew exactly who it was. It was a woman from Ulster, the daughter of Ailill, and princess of the northeast of Ireland. Her name was Etain. Angus, as a loyal foster son and a good host, didn't want to deny Medir anything, and so he went to seek for this Etain himself. He arrived at Ailill's house in Magnemeish, where he was welcomed and invited to stay for 3 nights. There he explained to Ailill who he was and what the reason for his journey was. And Ailill wasn't really happy about the request of Angus, for Angus was the son of the High King, and therefore Ailill wouldn't have any control over him once he gave his daughter away. But Angus didn't want to give up so easy, and so he asked Ailill what price he desired to give his daughter away. Ailill answered that he wanted Angus to clear 12 plains of his land for him, so that this land could be used for grazing cattle, for games, assemblies, gatherings, and strongholds. Angus agreed and answered it shall be done. He returned to Tara and met up with his father, the High King. The doctor immediately sent his men to do the job, and within a single day and night the 12 plains were cleared. Satisfied, Angus returned to Ailill to ask for Etain's hand. But Ailill declined, for Angus' job wasn't done yet. He gave him a new, even harder task, to draw out 12 great rivers from the moors and bogs to the sea, so that there would always be fish from the sea, and that the swamps would be drained. Once again, Angus was quite okay with that request, as long as he would get to fulfill his promise to Medir. And so he went back to his father in Tara and told him of his new quest. The doctor then used his magical powers and caused 12 great waters to arise from the bogs and moors and course towards the sea within a single day and night. After both tasks were fulfilled, it was obvious how much Ailill's people profited from them. But Ailill still wasn't entirely satisfied. And so Angus went back to Ailill just to get another, a last task, to bring gold and silver matching the weight of Etain. Angus sighed and agreed. Etten was weighed, and Eiðil was given enough gold and silver to satisfy his greed. Finally, Eiðil agreed to let Angus leave with Etten, and so the two young people left the house of Eiðil. They approached Midir, who already sat in his chariot, wearing the new clothes he got from Angus to welcome the woman he desired so much. Thankfully, Etten was just as pleased with Midir as he was with her, and so they shared their love and passion. Midir was more than satisfied with how Angus had fulfilled his requests, and spent a whole year with Angus in Brona Bonnie. After the year had passed, Midir returned to Brilley, taking Etten with him. You might have noticed that I only mentioned them sleeping with each other, but not marrying each other. Well, you must know that Midir did marry Etten, but only as a second wife, for he was already married. His wife was a woman named Fuamna, descendant of Beach, son of Jarnell. And you can imagine that she wasn't pleased when she found out what her husband had done. Angus even had tried to warn him that Midir's wife was as cunning and as intelligent and skilled in magic as all people of her race. She had been raised by a druid named Bresal Atalan, and therefore knew nearly every form of magic in existence. In other words, she was not someone you should anger lightly. However, Midir returned home and was welcomed by his wife. Fuamna offered to show the two lovers around, to see everything there was to see in their lands, finishing at their house. There, she told Etten that she had come into the seat of a good woman, and to sit down. But when Etten did as she was asked, Fuamna struck her with a scarlet rod made out of a quicken tree, which turned poor Etten into a pool of water. Afterwards, Fuamna fled to her foster father Bresal, while Midir was unable to stay in the flooded house, and so Midir left without a spouse. But that was not the end of the story. Oh no. Magic, especially the magic of the Tuatha Dé Danann, works in wondrous ways. The puddle was heated by the fire, and the wind blew through the open door and the windows, and so the puddle shrunk and shrunk, and only left behind a caterpillar. And as time went by, the little caterpillar transformed into the most beautiful purple butterfly you have ever seen. But like I said, wondrous ways, for the butterfly was indeed a butterfly, but not as small as you might expect, but big as a grown man's head. It is said that its voice and the hum of its wings was sweeter than the sound of harps and pipes. Its eyes shone in the dark like gems, and the mere smell of it would erase hunger and thirst from everyone in its presence. And even the small drops shed from its wings were magical, for they could cure any disease or sickness. Did I say it? Well, I mean hers, for this was still Etten. As soon as Midir saw the butterfly, he knew it was his beloved Etten, and he promised that as long as she stayed near him, he would never take another wife or even lover, for he truly loved her, no matter in which form. The sound of her gentle humming made him fall asleep in peace, and whenever any danger was close, she would simply wake him up. It could have been a tragic but somehow wholesome end. But of course, it was just a matter of time until Fuamna noticed what was going on, and she grew furious. One day, Fuamna decided to visit Midir, and with her she brought 3 of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Lu, Ogma, and the doctor himself. Midir was everything but pleased about her visit, and he swore and cursed towards her, and even threatened her life for what she had done to Etten. But of course, those were only words, for he knew what Fuamna was able to do with her magic, and that he didn't stand a chance against her. Fuamna wasn't impressed at all. She even told Midir that she didn't regret her deeds at all, and that she would hurt Etten in whatever shape she was and wherever in Ireland she might meet her. She summoned dark powers and created a fierce wind of magic and assault, trapping Etten in it and bringing her far from Briley and Meteor, for the poor butterfly wasn't able to escape the storm. 7 long years Etten was trapped in the horrible storm, and wasn't able to find a tree or anything else to settle upon, but only rocks of the sea and the waves of the ocean. After those 7 long years, the completely exhausted butterfly finally was able to land on the shoulders of Angus MacOak. Of course, in the meantime, Angus had heard of the wondrous magical butterfly and the wrath of Fuamna, and he instantly recognized Etten and welcomed her, and in a way apologized that he had a part in the story, in fulfilling her father's task to get her hand for Meteor. Angus carried the exhausted Etten home to the Brúna Bóinne and led her into a sunbower, for it had big crystal windows, and she could come and go as she pleased. Wherever he went from then on, he took the sunbower with him, so that he could always take care of her. He cared for her and comforted her and fed her wonderful smelling herbs, until she finally felt well again. Well, once more, it was no wonder that Fuamna heard of this. Her jealousy had never cooled down, and she always had an eye out for the woman who stole her husband. And so, she went to her husband, who knew of nothing, and told him to summon Angus so that she could make peace with both men. And so, Meteor sent a messenger. But Fuamna was so skilled in magic that she followed the messenger as a shadow, entered the Brúna Bóinne and found Etten. Again, she casted the dark magic that trapped Etten before, and Etten was carried out of the sunbower back into the merciless winds. Again, poor Etten fluttered around, unable to rest for years and years. When Angus arrived at Meteor, he knew that Fuamna had played both men. He told Meteor that Etten had been safe at his house, and both men instantly suspected that Fuamna might try to harm Etten. And so Angus rode back to the Brúna Bóinne as fast as he could. But when he arrived, he found the sunbower empty and shattered on the floor. Angry and weary, he stumbled upon Fuamna's tracks and followed them to the house of Fuamna's foster father Bresal. In his anger, Angus attacked her. Well, no one really knows what happened next, but in the end, both of them were consumed by the fires of Manannán mac Lir. Meanwhile, Etten fluttered constantly in the hellish storms Fuamna had cast, growing weaker and weaker. All the weakness had her shrunk into the size of a common butterfly, and she still couldn't land anywhere, until she finally was able to land on a roof tree of a house in Ulster. But she was too weak to even sit straight, and so she tumbled along the roof tree and fell right into the golden drinking cup of the wife of Etta the champion. Unfortunately, nobody noticed the little butterfly, and so she suddenly was swallowed whole by Etta's wife. But poor Etten wasn't digested, no. Instead, she was conceived by the womb of Etta's wife, and a while later was born again as a human baby and as daughter of Etta and his wife. Funny enough, Etta and his wife named their new daughter Etten. Until her second birth, 1,012 years had passed since she was born as the child of Ailill. You must know the Tuatha Dé Danann live considerably longer than a normal human being would do. Etten was raised as a daughter of Etta, together with 50 other chieftain daughters. One day, the young women bathed in a shallow river, when a tall horseman arrived and approached them. He rode a beautiful brown horse, with a curly mane and a curly tail. He wore a green mantle, and wore a silver shield, and a gold-banded spear, His golden hair was held back by a golden ring, so that it would not fall upon his face. He stopped his ride nearby, and all of the young maidens instantly had a crush on the handsome and fine young man. But then he spoke of a dark prophecy. He spoke of Etten, of a king who would need to chase birth from Tabor because of her, and who would drown his 2 horses in Loch da Ebrach. He spoke of many wars that the High King would need to fight because of her, and of the destruction of elf mounts. Dark words that didn't make any sense to the girls at the time. As he ended, he mounted his horse and rode off, without letting anyone know where he came from or where he went off to. Who was he? Why did he say what he said? And if it was a prophecy, how did he know? Are Angus MacOg and Fuana really dead? And will Media search for his beloved Etten? Well, I'll leave you with these questions for today, for this is the end of part 1. The story of Etten hasn't found its end yet. If you want to know how the story ends, tune in next week. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up. And if you happen to speak Irish and caught me mispronouncing something, please let me know in the comments down below how to pronounce it correctly. Goromil Morgat. See you next time. Bye!